Orion Taraban is a clinical psychologist who specializes in the psychology of modern dating and the differences in what men and women value in relationships. Here we talk about relationships, the psychology of depression, Buddhism, psychedelics, some little-known psychological facts about mental illnesses, and much more. This is part 2 of a 4-hour podcast.
Going back to the Piraha, another interesting thing about them is that Daniel Everett explains this concept of immediacy of experience. So they have a word, it's ibipio, and it means this, something has happened and now it has exited reality or has entered reality. So the thing has entered or exited the bounds of experience. And so they will say that person left, that person left the bounds of experience, or like they went down that way.
Instead of they passed on or they died?
No, just they went around the corner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can't see them.
I see.
So they they're not within my realm of experience. And so then he was trying to figure out how the word was used, and he noticed that, they would often use it if someone left or went out of sight. But then they used it as a verb regarding a candle where the flame was flickering. And so the flame was like flickering in and out of existence. So they said it's ibipioing. But the point is he explains that he uses that to explain that they very much value what is happening right now. And they don't have grammatical structures for past or future. And he says that they talk about they can talk about like tomorrow or yesterday, but it doesn't seem to be very important, especially considering they don't have grammatical structures for it. They don't even have words for tomorrow or yesterday. They just have other day. So like other time that is not right now. And they especially don't talk about the distant past or the distant future. And so that's tied with this other observation that he made where he said, like, just looking at the amount of time these people spend smiling, they must be the happiest people he's ever seen.
Maybe. Depends on what smiling means in their culture, I suppose.
Yeah. And so if we are to assume they are as happy as they seem, then what do you think about this idea of like, kind of trying to confine your temporal focus?
Well, it could be good and bad. Like if you have a very restrictive temporal focus so that the present moment is the only thing that exists and your present moment is terrible, painful, and horrendous, you're in hell. I mean, that could be what hell is. And you don't see any alternative because that's all that exists in your, what'd you call it, domain of experience? And it could be the only thing that could exist within your domain of experience because you can't even consider possible options that don't exist yet that could exist in the future. So living in the present can be a good thing, provided that you can mostly attend to your survival and comfort and satisfaction, I would imagine. Otherwise, it would be very difficult.
I see. So yeah, you could say you're living in the moment, but that could also manifest as like hopelessness about the future.
Could, if the situation were really bad.
Uh-huh.
But I think in my understanding of your discussion about their conception of time, they got a lot of things right, in my opinion. Like, time doesn't really move. That's an illusion that is like an emergent phenomenon from our own subjectivity. And you can even approach this from like the perspective of modern physics. Like Einstein talked about how time was the fourth dimension. We don't say that space moves. We move through space. Time doesn't move. We move through time. But because of our frame of reference, we think that time moves. No, we're the ones moving. Time doesn't move. Mm-hmm. There is no past and there is no future. There's just the subjective past and the subjective future. But the past does not exist somewhere. The future does not exist somewhere. I've never seen tomorrow, ever. I might not ever. So, and you can think about it like this. So, no, Ryan, there's the successive moments. Like this is the present moment. But within that present moment is actually an infinite series of divisible sub-moments. And so what we consider to be the instantaneous present moment is actually composed of an infinitude of infinitely divisible time points. So you can extrapolate that from the opposite direction, is that we just have a cultural or maybe even a biological bias towards this is a pinch. This is the present moment. But for another organism, that our conceptualization of a point in time could be composed of many, many points. And to another organism, many, many of our points could be collapsed into a single point. It has to do with our perception of our own motion through time. From a large enough standpoint, there is only the eternal now. From the perspective of that eternity, all of the moments that we're subject to passing through are a single moment.
Have you experienced that concept subjectively?
I have, but it's very rare. It's pretty difficult to get to. It's going to sound paradoxical, but it's not that like when the experience of time stops, motion continues. I know that sounds paradoxical because we think that we need time to move, but it's almost like things can move through time, but they're this is going to be very difficult to explain. Like motion is still possible even though time doesn't move. I don't know how else to put it.
You mean that literally, or that you experience that subjectively?
Well, I experience that subjectively, but we know that literally time does not move. Like time doesn't move. Our clocks move, our hearts beat, but that's like saying width moves.
I see what you mean. Okay. Can you tell us more about how you arrived there?
Oh, that was under the influence of some psychedelics.
Okay, I see. You had mentioned something that happened when you were hiking after several weeks. This was a particular video of yours. It sounded like you had this kind of, collapsing in and out of existence moment.
Yeah, that one was not a psychedelic moment. That one was purely based on meditative practice. And for whatever reason in that moment, I was able to slip into a very deep, peaceful state in which I lost all sense of self and therefore lost any orientation to time and space. And I entered into an experience of nothingness, nothingness, where nothing exists. It was just the infinite void. That was my subjective experience of it. And I have no idea how long I was there. Because I wasn't aware of an observer in that moment. I was the void. There was no difference between observed and observer in that moment. And then when I came out of that experience, it was as if the universe was being created again in that instant of awareness. From going from identification with the infinite nothingness to a perception of the created universe was like the Big Bang. And I think that the Buddhists often talk about how the mind is the universe on some level, which is actually borne out by some of our understandings in quantum mechanics. Like we need an observer in order for things to exist. And until an observer exists, there really isn't anything. So, and this also potentially is why they talk about in order to change the universe, you need only change yourself, because the universe on some level only exists inside of yourself, at least in any kind of functional way that we can approach. Like you've never experienced anything outside of your own consciousness. Me neither. Which is why it's sometimes strange when people sometimes dismissively say, well, that's just all in your head. It's like, well, what is it? Yeah. Everything that you've ever experienced has occurred within your consciousness. So what is consciousness? So that's a very difficult thing to approach.
It reminds me of the phrase or teaching from Buddhism, all forms are empty.
Sure, that's a useful one.
Which is similar to what is it? Isn't that like the first line in the Tao Te Ching, where it's like
the first line is the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao, which is somewhat analogous to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I might have be misremembering or interpretation or something. But basically, I thought the point was that basically everything is created by the Tao, but the Tao doesn't exist.
In the sense that it can't ever be constrained by a definition. Because as soon as we say it's that, we're wrong. Because we're inappropriately identifying the Tao with an expression of the Tao. That's my understanding anyway, which is sort of like how in some of those infuriatingly vague Zen koans, they're like, you know, they answer in such a vague, indirect way because the mind has this tendency to take things very concretely and literally, and words are constrained by our associations and conceptualizations. And reality has no obligation to conform to our cognitive constructs of reality. And so sometimes we can be mistaken in thinking that we understand reality when we really just kind of constrained a part of it in the cage of our own concepts.
It's like a question like, what is the meaning of life? It's like whatever the meaning of life is, it could never be constrained so much that it can be expressed in words.
Probably. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. For one other reason that we touched on earlier is that there's this infuriating asymmetry between like specificity and vagueness. It's like the moment you say anything is this way, you will be able to find, just like that tribe in the Amazon, some exception somewhere that disproves that generalization. Which is why sometimes the highest wisdom is so vague and idiotic sounding. It is what it is. It's like, thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Now, by the same token, you could say things like, well, all beings just want to be happy. It's like, okay, maybe that's true, but it's also very useless because what makes you happy might not make me happy. Right. And so if we're actually going to use that to implement changes or to make decisions in reality, it's not actually a useful guide because what is happiness? Do you understand? And so when things are very, very true, they're generally not very useful. Now, if I were to give you very specific feedback, in order to be happy, you need to go to the gym 3 times a week, and you need to have sex 4 times a month, and you need to have 8 friends. It's like, that's not very generalizable. It might actually work and be actionable to a subset of the population, but it's not very generalizable. That's like why scripted pickup doesn't work. Even though a lot of men out there would sure like it to work. It's like, what you do is you just go up to a woman and you place your hand on her left shoulder. You look into the eye for 2.3 seconds. You say, hey, and that will work. That will work. It's like, that doesn't work. Like there was this, who was the guy? The German military strategist who wrote on war basically said, I can't tell you how to win a war because as soon as I tell you how to do that, the really smart people will find a way around that. So I can't actually tell you what to do. I can just give you these basic principles. Like in general, it's better to have the higher ground, but there are times when even that is a liability. So what's the alternative? That we say nothing? There's nothing to say about winning a war. Obviously, that's not true because some people are better at doing that than others. So we have to strike this balance where we have to understand that when we talk in generalizations, yes, there's always going to be exceptions to that on an individual level, but the alternative to that is to make things so concrete that they're not generalizable, which isn't very helpful to people. I don't think that it can be solved one way or the other. This is an inherent problem. And we see this in podcasting all the way up into religion.
Yeah, at some point, I used to have way more caveats in my writing. Say like, well, say one thing and then, have a whole nother sentence of just caveating and like being like, well, technically this isn't applicable to these particular contexts, blah, 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 blah. And then after I was like, you know what? Anything I say is going to be, there's going to be the reasonable person who can say like, oh, okay, he probably means this. Like, oh, I could see technically where, I might poke some little hole in that particular way of phrasing that particular thing. But the average reasonable person would be like, oh yeah, I know what you mean. They're not.
Yes, the average reasonable person. I mean, think about this conversation. If every time you asked me about depression, I had to preface my answer with saying, now this isn't true for everyone, and there's going to be exceptions. And some of the research suggests this, and some of the research suggests that. And it's important to always check this out with your actual physician and the people who are entrusted with your medical care. And to understand that this is not a legally or medically binding intervention. I'm not actually prescribing anything to you. And in case I'm often wrong, I have certainly been wrong in the past, and I might not be right in this particular instance. And I fully recognize the limits of my biases. There are also unknown unknowns that I might not even be aware of. Like I might not ever even answer your question, even though all of those things are true. And how tedious and ridiculous would that be? But that's often the criticisms that I can sometimes receive from people, is that I wish that he had a more nuanced approach, or that he appreciated that what he said isn't true for everybody. It's like, yeah, I do appreciate those things.
Right.
But unless you don't want anybody to ever open their mouth again, we kind of have to make allowances for people. And we certainly don't want to collapse that into, well, your opinion is just as valid as my opinion. It's often not. People can be experts. People can be masters.
I want to wrap around real quick back to your experience when you're hiking, when everything kind of stopped, right? You had this feeling of nothingness. Did you feel like that led to a lasting or a lasting change in how you experience the world from that point on?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
And I talk about this in that video that you're alluding to called The Gift of Nothingness, in which I describe how the common conceptualization of the miraculous is wrong. Like we talk about, the faithful talk about how it was a miracle that Jesus walked on water, or he raised Lazarus from the dead. Why are those miracles? Because humans don't float like that. And when people are dead, they don't come back to life. Like these experiences, these phenomena are contrary to everything we understand about the laws that govern physical reality. But in this conceptualization, the miraculous is anchored to our understanding of physical reality. When the fact of the matter is that there's nothing to suggest that physical reality should even exist to begin with. So if you anchor instead at the nothingness that doesn't even contain the potential to be something, then the fact that anything exists whatsoever is absolutely miraculous. How do you get anything out of nothing? Like that doesn't make any sense. In fact, if you go into cosmology, they have to posit the existence of what they call phantom particles to explain the Big Bang, which are like these potential quasi-particles that can like emerge out of the void, but then the void doesn't contain nothing. It contains potential. Yeah. So where did the potential come from? You know, it just kicks the can down the road. Now it's tortoises all the way down. So if you anchor instead, and I don't mean this conceptually because I was able, for whatever reason, to enter into that subjective experience. This was a felt experience. It's not like a cognitive trick that I'm playing on myself. I don't think that would work. But because I know what that feels like, I can carry that memory around with me, then like the whole world, in all of its like everyday reality, even its banality, becomes miraculous. And I think this is on some level the essence of Zen. There was a good book written by Soto Beck called Nothing Special, which I think is at the heart of Zen. Because on some level, if nothing is special, then everything can be. But if some things are special, then clearly some things are not. Walking on water is miraculous, but the fact that water fucking exists at all is not. That's just water. It's like, really? You don't find water miraculous? Well, no, it's just hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Why the fuck do those things exist? And why do they form that particular covalent bond at that angle, which causes ice to float instead of sink, even though it becomes more dense? Like, there's so many things that we just take for granted because they've always been a part of our conscious experience, that we think that they are the same as consciousness.
I feel like it's like we have been in this constant process of stripping the magic out of the world by giving everything names.
And we think we understand it.
Right? So for example, the placebo effect is basically magic. You have this person who has some insane burning nerve pain. They say, oh, my pain is at a 7 out of 10. They give him a substance, there's nothing in it, just sugar water or something. They say it's a very powerful anesthetic. And then he says, oh, that really worked. My pain's at a 2 out of 10. And they look at his brain, and it actually reflects someone who, they took a brain scan before and after, and he literally has less pain. But then we say, oh, yeah, that's a placebo effect. It's not magic.
Well, what's amazing is that, and placebos can be effective even when people know that they're placebos. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
They're not as effective, but they still show therapeutic benefit. Like, you can tell people that this has no therapeutic property. There are no active ingredients in this. This is a sugar pill. But if they believe, you don't have to trick them. They trick themselves in a lot of cases. Now, this is a tricky thing. So I talk about this in one of my interviews. So we too often believe that our ability to give a name to something means that we understand that something. So the very simple example, kids, when they're not used to being alive yet, most of them. So they have a lot of questions.
Most of them.
about reality, right? So they might ask their parents, Daddy, why are leaves green? And Daddy, very confident in his own knowledge, will say, well, son, that's because of chlorophyll. As if that explains anything, because it's like, well, why the fuck is chlorophyll green?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's because there are certain pigments inside the chlorophyll, and pigments differentially absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect others. Good question. Yeah, Daddy, but why does that pigment reflect those wavelengths of light and not others? Oh, okay. Well, different wavelengths of light are associated with different energies. And this is getting harder to answer. We don't know. It just is. Stop asking so many questions. Like, most parents eventually reach a point where they're frustrated with their children asking why. Probably because it exposes their own ignorance. Now, here's the thing. The alternative to that throughout most of human history has been to kind of walk around in sort of an odd superstition of nature and to invest it with like gods and supernatural powers. Yeah. Our ability to name certain things and to dismantle certain processes allows us to do things. It allows us to build heavier than air flight. It allows us to build effective medicines. It allows us to build houses that will withstand earthquakes. Like, our knowledge is useful, but it doesn't mean that we understand things on a deep existential level. And the danger of that understanding is that it rips all of the mystery and awe out of being alive. But the alternative could be to go back to like a benighted, superstitious, animistic state, which I don't think is really where we need to be either. I think we should employ our reason where it's reasonable to do so. So I think ideally we can do both. We can understand that our reason can be applied to do useful things, and that we do know some things, but that most things we don't know, and we can never know. I think it's possible to do both.
Trip reports can be really boring, but let me share one I had done a particularly strong psychedelic in Europe. And I got into this space to where I had experienced ego death, which is similar. It's surely different in some ways, but similar to what you described before about how, like, you know, you go into this nothingness, and the nothingness just felt like a kind of light, white light without any sort of other content at all. And so what was interesting was how I would go in and out of that. Was I was with some people, and whenever they were talking, they would say something, and I would be pretty much lucid. I could just have a conversation with them. But then they would say something, and I'd be like, oh, wait, what do they mean? What does that mean? And then that might kind of collapse down into like, well, what does that key word mean? And like trying to comprehend what the fundamental meaning of the word or anything would drop me back into the ego death. So anytime I tried to understand something at its like core level, I would just kind of like knock out.
Wow.
So I thought that was kind of it's sort of like, it felt like my psyche was constantly revealing to me the limitations of my understanding of anything. It's like, oh, what does that really mean? You don't actually know.
That makes sense. And I bet that if you did that more, you could get used to it.
Yeah.
And you could exist in that state lucidly and with awareness for longer periods of time.
Without the psychedelic?
I mean, I think you can if we can put any faith into the testimonies of a lot of the advanced meditators that have come down through us through history.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, there is this tendency to discount cognitive or spiritual phenomena that occurs under the influence of psychedelics. Which, you know, I think you should take things that you experience under substances with a grain of salt. But it's like everything changes your, you can say your brain chemistry, or you can say your physiology, or you can say your consciousness on some level. It's like some mystics didn't take mushrooms. They fasted for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Other mystics would spin around in circles until they got dizzy. Some mystics would embrace marble statues, you know, naked. So they're dealing with the limits of hypothermia. And that would arrive them in certain places.
Yeah.
So doing things or not doing things changes your experience of self. You because you're constantly in a process of becoming. You are not really a thing, you are a process. On some level, nouns don't exist. Everything is in the process of becoming something else. A noun is a conceptual projection that we put on reality to constrain it for some useful end. But it's important to remember that nothing is ever static. Everything is a verb. And that's interesting because when they talk about, in Christianity, for example, or Judeo-Christian traditions that use the Old Testament, they talk about how God is the Word, right? And word is a noun. But in the Christianity that's been translated into like Romance languages, they don't use this. They don't say that God is the word. They say that God is the verb, which I think is probably closer to the truth. So they see that the omnipresence of reality is a process that is always becoming what it is, and that's all it ever will be. Which is very difficult to wrap your mind around, which is why we tend to want to constrain things into concepts. Who talks about, what book is this? Oh, the Denial of Death. Have you read that? Oh, you got to read that book, man. You still recording? Okay.
Yeah.
You got to read that book. It won the Pulitzer Prize in '75 by a psychoanalyst named Ernest Becker. Really cool. And he talks about how terrifying it can be for individuals whose, let's say, conceptual blinders, for whatever reason, fall away, and they're confronted with the awful majesty and terrifying miraculousness of the universe. Like, how could you go and do your job if you truly appreciated what a miracle it was to be alive?
Yeah.
How could you pay your taxes?
Yeah.
Would you really clean your toilet? It would be very, very difficult. Now, of course, you can be so exposed to that state that you eventually can see the miraculousness in the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the miraculousness at your job, because if all of creation is miraculous relative to the anchor point of nothingness, then it certainly exists in your toilet and at your job as well. It doesn't just happen at ashrams and yoga retreats and cathedrals with stained glass windows. That doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes some getting used to. Usually it's terrifying, and people can have even psychotic breaks when they first come into contact with that reality.
Daniel Ingram wrote he has a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and he talks a lot about the dark night.
Dark night of the soul, passing through that?
Yeah.
Okay. I know about that from a Christian tradition, but not so much from a Buddhist perspective.
He talks about it in terms of people will go on this meditation journey, and they're actually making significant progress in their meditative advancements. But there can be a portion of those, sometimes that progress can manifest as like intense, difficult suffering and bewilderment by the world, and you're like lost and confused and you don't understand reality. And then it can even be to the point where people will like get diagnosed as with some kind of psychosis. And one of the things he explains is that it would be really good if this was a better known thing, that like practitioners were like, okay, what's happening in your life? Oh, you've been going through like a 30-day meditative retreat. Okay, that might be something to do with it. You don't have schizophrenia. You might just be in this particular situation. And usually the remedy, I can't remember specifically what he recommends. I don't know if he recommends anything, but one of the remedies is to keep meditating. And so it's like, it's part of the path of like, you're almost there. It's like terrible right here, but you got to keep going and you can get through it.
Mm-hmm. That certainly can be the case. It's difficult though, because it's not a component of everybody's spiritual journey. Like it's very bizarre how people arrive at enlightenment when they arrive at enlightenment. Like you hear stories of Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus, where he is a Roman commander, and then he has a vision and he's converted into being a disciple of Jesus. Like, what was his particular merit? He certainly wasn't praying. He wasn't meditating. He wasn't following the scriptures, as far as I was aware. And yet, for whatever reason, he was chosen for this divine vision, which instantly transformed him spiritually. I also think that God definitely has a sense of humor. Like, for example, why was Moses, a murderer, chosen to bring the 10 Commandments down from Mount Sinai, one of which includes, thou shalt not murder, Like, I'm sure that wasn't lost on God. Like, he chose a murderer to bring that teaching to the people. It's very interesting that that was the person that was chosen. And you might think, well, you need to be virtuous and good in order to receive enlightenment and spiritual transformation. But if you look at the history of so many spiritual traditions, some of the folks who seem to have been awarded with the most merit and the furthest spiritual transformations had all kinds of sin in their background. Some that would be very unpardonable from a legal or a civic standpoint. Who was it? St. Augustine, who in his Confessions very famously said and prayed to God, said, "Oh Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." He lived with a mistress that he had an illegitimate child by for many, many years. He was even engaged to a 13-year-old when he was in his 30s. He eventually broke that arrangement off when he had his spiritual conversion and convinced that woman to join a nunnery herself. Story. But like some of the most celebrated saints and most famous spiritual religious personages were often folks of questionable virtue and repute. So everybody's path is different. Everybody's path is different. So to return to what you're saying, not everyone is going to pass through that dark period of the soul where things become very destabilized. But yeah, folks who are in a position to minister to people in a spiritual capacity should be aware, and often are aware, that that phenomenon can exist and can affect people. This is why, for example, it may be inappropriate on some level to offer like ayahuasca tourism, which can happen in Peru and Ecuador, where people pay $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 to fly down and participate in one or two ceremonies. Sometimes it can happen that in the context of those ceremonies, they experience a radical reevaluation of self and reality. And then they get put on a plane and go back to their lives, often with people who have absolutely low conceptualization of what they might have just experienced. And there has been, unfortunately, instances of people having psychotic breaks and even killing themselves as a consequence of not having the context of support to help them navigate that radical destabilization of their sense of self and reality.
I've done ayahuasca before, and there was this moment where it was kind of like, oh, okay, I see how people can be crazy now. Like it was like I was kind of like looking through a membrane, and it's like, I'll be good, but like I can kind of see, like if I go over there,
madness is a potential that lurks in every human mind. It's a chaos,
right?
And it's almost like that feeling that you might get when you're standing on the edge of a cliff.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
I could just throw myself off this cliff, and you're like, where the fuck did that come from? You know? But I think a lot of people experience that. There's this like dark impulse towards chaos and dissolution that exists potentially in every human being.
Yeah, even standing on the edge of a cliff, or even sometimes simple dumb things like you're meeting a friend's girlfriend and you're like, oh man, it would be really inappropriate if I threw my ice cream at her. It's just these like random intrusive thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? There are some, I had an acupuncturist once, and he told me that in his tradition, I think it was a form of Chinese. I don't know which dialect, but they referred to the brain as like the sea of bone marrow. Like that's the literal translation, because if you open the skull, the brain looks white, like bone marrow looks white, and it's wavy like the sea. So the sea of bone marrow. And in this not all thoughts arise within the person thinking them, which is totally outside of the realm of what we consider to be possible from a Western tradition. Instead, just like water, like the sea, the mind can reflect thoughts that might come from outside of its own self.
Interesting.
Some folks think of the mind as like a receiver, like an antenna that can pick up on things that are already existing in the universe. It's very difficult to approach these from a Western scientific perspective. But it certainly does seem to be, let's say, phenomenologically accurate. Like, where did that thought come from? We'd have to, from a Western perspective, I assume, like really thoroughly dive into your unconscious and say that there is some sort of repressed aggressive instinct that exists inside of you, Joseph, that in that moment, as a defense against what could potentially be an inappropriate sexual arousal to your friend's girlfriend, you had to defend yourself against acting on that by throwing the ice cream at her, because otherwise you would have done something even more inappropriate. Who the fuck knows? But like that, be like, yeah, I could see how that could be true.
Right.
Versus maybe some random thought just came into your consciousness that wasn't even really yours, but you experienced as yours. No, that's not possible. That's crazy.
The funny thing is we have all these contradictions in terms of what we consider to be valid. So if you said, it used to be the case that we assume that depression or epilepsy was the result of being possessed by an evil spirit. I think it was King Saul, 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 who had, severe, basically many interpretations of that particular story in the Bible was that he had depression. He had clinical depression. But then in the story, of course, he was possessed by an evil spirit. And so we'll say, come on, possessed by an evil spirit, that's why you have depression? That's ridiculous. But people will use phrases like demons that I have to fight. So it's like, how is one, not that it's invalid, I'm just saying it's kind of like, we're like accepting, it's almost arbitrary. It's like, why is personal demons accepted, but like possessed by an evil spirit is scoffed at?
Mm-hmm. I can see that. Well, here to complicate that even further, it's like we still kind of believe in demons. We don't say demon, we say depression. Now, when people say the explanation for demon possession is incorrect, they'll say, because show me a demon. Like, point to it. What's the proof that demons exist? Like, show me some evidence in the existence of demons. Like, fair enough, right? But show me some examples that depression exists. Like, it's ontologically an entity that we can point to, or it will consistently show up in some sort of scan. That's where we started this conversation, and said, that is depression right there. What we've done is we've reified, which means to make a thing out of something that is an experience. It's immaterial. But we've forgotten we've done that because we think that that's objective and empirical, versus the demon is more of like symbolic or metaphorical.
Yeah.
But on some level, the depression is kind of a metaphor as well, because it it has just as much ontological validity as a demon. It is a way of talking about an experience that makes sense to the person that you're talking to. It wouldn't make sense for me to talk about demons anymore. It makes sense for me to talk about depression. That doesn't necessarily mean they're that different. Though, of course, how we conceptualize that will determine how we treat it, right?
True, yeah.
That's why it's kind of important. And that's why, of course, if we conceptualize this as depression, and we conceptualize depression as being caused by an imbalance in brain chemicals, it will be treated by adding brain chemicals. How else would it be treated? It makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Rory Sutherland?
The name sounds familiar, but you might have to.
He's, I'm not sure how to describe him, but he may be an economist, but he points out some very interesting things about economists, I suppose. So to give an example, he'll be talking about transportation, and it's like, how do you improve a train ride? And then he explains how this train company spent some billions of dollars making the train, the commute from London to this other place 30 minutes faster. It's going to save, billions of hours. Something, it sounds great. And he says, well, you could have just, at this time, this was when not everyone had their own like 5G connection on their phone. So he said, well, you could have spent way less money and just put Wi-Fi on the trains, and you would have gotten so many more pleased customers, because the train would go from like this, like, I'm just sitting here wasting my time, to it's like, oh, this is fun. I get to use Wi-Fi, do some work or something. And so, we're often measuring things in the wrong way. And one of the things he talks about is that we learned of the placebo effect, and then we said, okay, now we got to design all our trials to account for the placebo effect. But where are the trials where we say, okay, we have the active ingredient, and then we did these other things to maximize the placebo effect so that people can get like the most psychological trickery to give them the most benefit? And so instead of maximizing the placebo effect, we're just kind of concerned about the active ingredient. And one particular example is he says how one of the things that can induce a stronger placebo effect is you take a generic aspirin, give it a nice fancy brand, and charge more for it, and it will actually work better.
Yeah, more expensive placebos are more effective than cheaper. Ones that are named with scientific names are more effective. Those that are administered by a doctor in a white coat are more effective. All of these have been manipulated in various trials. That's why when I talked about the evidence with respect to supporting the efficacy of SSRIs, I talk about how there hasn't been a study that I'm aware of that demonstrates a good randomized controlled trial of an SSRI relative to an active placebo. And as opposed to like a sugar pill, an active placebo is something that has some sort of like side effect, like dry mouth, that people normally associate with medicine. And so they have this physiological response and they think, oh, I figured it out. I got the medicine here. And that facilitates the placebo effect. So a good placebo does about as much as an SSRI. A bad placebo, you can design studies to basically prove whatever you want. An SSRI will outperform a bad placebo under certain time constraints.
Wow. So I didn't know that. There are studies that basically finding that if you use an active placebo, it's about as good as an SSRI.
Yeah. They generally don't happen in America, though. They've happened in Europe.
There was this recent BMJ paper, and he was talking about all these different interventions for depression. And they checked exercise, strength training, walking and jogging, Tai Chi or Qigong, and yoga. All of those outperformed SSRIs.
Behavioral activation. I mean, and I did a number of classes when I was working in community mental health on the mind-body connection, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. It's extremely difficult to feel good inside of a body that is weak, that is frail, that is toxified. To think that on some level, my mind is this totally separate entity also kind of runs afoul of, it's strangely incongruous with the primacy of like the brain, where we think that like, oh no, these things aren't the mind, it's the brain that does these things. Okay, well your brain is also a part of your body. So if you take care of your body more generally, like why does the only way to take care of your brain and your body have to be through pharmaceutical intervention? Why can't it be through lifestyle changes? Why can't it be through exercise? Why can't it be through appropriate nutrition or detoxification? Like it's very difficult to feel good inside of an unhealthy body.
There are some things where, for example, if like if someone has diarrhea, how can you you can't focus on anything, especially if you're just you can't be happy about anything. You can't be.
It's possible, but it's hard. It's tough, man.
Yeah.
Like if we look at the sages and some of the highest teachings of wisdom that we have, it is possible to be content and peaceful under any circumstance. I mean, there are those monks in Southeast Asia who lit themselves on fire.
Oh, yeah.
There are people who entombed themselves in shrines in lotus position so that they would be mummified in that posture forever. There are people, Christian martyrs, who have withstood all kinds of tortures. It's it's amazing what some people can do. Right. Those are extraordinary individuals, of course, right?
That particular Vietnamese monk, I'm sure you've seen the footage of him being immolated.
It's amazing.
Doesn't move at all.
So it's possible, but it's extremely difficult, right? It's possible to feel happy and peaceful if you're poor, if you're isolated, if you are unhealthy, if you are in chronic pain. But boy, that's the fucking advanced course. You'd have to have all kinds of skills and virtues at your disposal to be able to overcome those difficulties. And those people are the least likely to have them in many respects. The people who are subject to the chronic pain and the poverty and the want.
Right. It's like the walking or jogging was at the top of the list for the interventions for depression. And so that might sound kind of silly, but there was this, I think he's a neuroscientist, Daniel Wolpert. He has this great TED Talk, and he starts off the talk by saying, you have a reason for having, the reason you have a brain, there's only one reason for it, and that is so that you can move the body. And he says, that is the core reason. And all the ideas and creative insights you have, if they are not connected, they only exist because they will eventually be translated into bodily movement. Yes. Yeah. And so the example he gives is of a sea squirt who, at this early stage of its life, it has a nervous system, but then what it does is it floats around through the sea where it's going to find a rock that is situated where plenty of nutrients are floating around that area. And then once it finds that area, it'll attach to the rock and it'll live there forever. And it's just there.
Sometimes they even dissolve their own nervous systems, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
they don't need their brain anymore.
Yeah. It's like, I'm done. Mm-hmm. And so then it's like,
you see that with anglerfish too. It's one of the few species where the female is significantly larger than the male. And in that life cycle, the male kind of finds a big female and bites onto her and kind of like dissolves their skin, and they actually form into kind of a symbiote organism, in which case the male kind of ceases to function as an individual and is kind of like dissolved from the inside out, whereas the female just uses him as a kept source of sperm to reproduce the species. So that also kind of fits with what this guy was talking about. Yeah, anglerfish are metal, man. They go hard.
That is nuts. So it's kind of like, why would movement help the brain? It's like, well, the entire reason you have a brain is for movement. There's this book by John Rady, and he talks about it's just this entire book about how exercise and moving the body in these different ways of moving the body is just amazingly important for mental health.
Sure, absolutely. And we're also getting at, it's difficult to know the relationship between the body and consciousness. We still don't have a good explanation for what consciousness is. Since we've been talking about spirituality, for instance, there has been an acknowledged relationship between temporal lobe epilepsy and spiritual visions. Have you heard about this?
No.
Not all epilepsy is the sort of flop on the floor kind. Epilepsy is sort of like a chaotic firing of neurons in certain parts of the brain. Sometimes it associates with physical convulsions if that epileptic seizure occurs in like a motor part of the brain. But seizures can occur in other parts of the brain that don't cause seizures. But they can cause a host of other psychological or phenomenological effects depending on where in the brain they occur. And some seizures are associated with aura. Have you heard about that?
Isn't it like a migraine or something?
Sometimes auras can be associated with migraines as well, which is within the experience of the person suffering the aura. Sometimes they feel like flooded with light. It's not painful, but they feel this rapid influx of light, and everything sort of becomes clearer or slows down. Like they can be associated with significant spiritual experiences. They're interpreted as significant spiritual experiences. Now, sometimes there's this really great fiction book called Lying Awake. I haven't read this book in so long, but it's actually really good. It's a work of fiction that relates around this nun who's living in a nunnery. And she has been blessed with these spiritual visions where she sees this flood of light and she is overwhelmed with the miraculousness of existence, etc., etc. until one day she actually has a seizure. And then she goes into a medical doctor who tells her that, sorry, these aren't actually spiritual visions. These are temporal lobe epilepsies. You have a tumor in your brain. And if we don't remove the tumor, you will likely die. But if we do remove the tumor, you probably won't have those miraculous experiences again. And the book is sort of about her decision. It's really interesting. So we could basically, in that way, and she has her own crisis of faith. It's like, what I was deluded this entire time. And I was even sort of proud of my delusion. I thought that I was special. I thought that I was singled out for these visions because of some particular spiritual merit. And really, it was my malfunctioning brain. And so she's forced to kind of reevaluate what it means to be faithful, what it means to be miraculous. I won't give away the ending, but it's a really good book. It's a book of ideas.
I've always kind of wondered if spiritual experiences sound to the average physician like, oh, that just sounds like you're having some kind of psychotic break, or maybe you have a tumor that we need to investigate.
Maybe. But my point here is that you could reduce those experiences to say, oh, those were just temporal lobe seizures. But who's potentially to say that the reason why she was having the temporal lobe seizures was because she was having the mystical experiences? Like, why do we necessarily assume that the one comes before the other? Like, clearly there is some sort of parallel between what happens in our mind and our consciousness and what happens in our brain. And the typical presumption is that what happens in the brain precedes what happens in consciousness, because there are studies that talk about how awareness of a certain stimulation always comes after the brain stimulation itself. So I think they studied this by examining motor cortex activation. And they put a person in a scanner, and they basically asked them to, like, I'm not going to get this right exactly, but it's sort of like to push a button when they become aware of, like, their intention to move. And what they always saw was that there was a firing on the brain scan before they signaled that they were aware of the intention. So the common belief is that the awareness arose out of the physical substrate. But there could be other explanations. One of them is that it can take a while for an experience in consciousness to emerge in awareness. And that could account for the delay between the neuronal activation and the awareness. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the neuronal activation and emergence in consciousness didn't occur simultaneously. This is actually a very old idea that was, I think, not in this language, but was promoted by Bishop Berkeley, I think maybe in the 15th century, a long time ago. And he talked about how mind and spirit were kind of parallel. It was mysterious. But like what happens in one always has like an immediate simultaneous correlate in the other. And the one doesn't precede the other. That, of course, leads to the ghost in the machine paradox. Was like, well, okay, how does the soul, or how does awareness or consciousness, how does it move the body? How does something that's immaterial move the body? I don't know.
Let me see. You're seeing a delay in the neuronal activation. Is that kind of an argument against free will, or is it?
Some people use it that way, yeah.
Okay.
That you just think that you have free will, but you really are experiencing, physical determinism.
That is kind of a component of Buddhism, almost basically that the subjective experience of a self is just another sensation like anything else, like something touching your leg or you tasting something. It's just like you have all these other brain modules brain activity generating these different experiences, you have another piece of brain activity that is saying like, I did that, I did that, I did that. That's me, that's me, that's me. And so, which is evidenced by the fact that you can get to experience no self, right? It's where you can, it's kind of ego death, and you can still experience and have your subjective experience without the felt experience of a observer or a central observer, which is
because it's just experience.
Yeah.
It's in that ego death, there's also a dissolution of the separation between self and other. And there's just experience or sensation, or whatever you want to describe it, reality, the universe. Yeah. But this determinism argument it's complicated. We can think of our actions as just being physically determined. Like if there really is no self or soul or spirit, then you are just a bunch of molecules that are engaged in some sort of physiological process that occurs according to very, more or less strict laws of physics. And you don't really exist, though you think you do. And you're also not really responsible because you couldn't do otherwise, even if you wanted to, because all of your actions were determined long ago. But we can also approach this from you can think of karma on some level as like a spiritual determinism, right? In some traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, well, why do people suffer in this life? Because of things that happened back there. And so the things that I have to go through, the things that I'm experiencing now are a consequence of actions that were set in motion long ago. There's a sort of, you understand, like a spiritual determinism there.
A long chain of dominoes.
Now, if there was only determinism, though, then how does anyone ever resolve their karma?
I guess you need to extinguish the want somehow.
But how could you do that unless you were already determined to do that?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess I'm not arguing one way or the other, but I'm just assuming that the logic would be that like either the dominoes have been set up to where they arrive at that extinguishing of desire, or they haven't.
Yes. So that's kind of, I think, one way to approach this is that it may not look this way, but everything has been set up so that everyone will eventually arrive at this state. Or maybe you're just one of the unlucky damned, I guess, in certain traditions, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. Sort of like Calvinist predestination kind of a thing. But that also means that you have no real responsibility one way or the other, because you're either one of the lucky ones who, whether you want to or not, you're going to arrive, or you're not, which means no matter what you do, you're fucked, which is not a very useful framework for moving through the world. What some psychological studies have shown is that regardless of whether or not free will exists, it is a very useful concept for people to believe in free will. People who believe in free will are more responsible. They're less likely to violate rules. They're less likely to violate social norms, etc. So like whether or not there's more than one way to evaluate a belief or a thought. You can evaluate it based on whether it's true or not, but you can also evaluate thoughts or beliefs by whether they're useful or not. Certain things are true but not useful. Other things are useful but not true. Ideally, we want both, true and useful, right? But there's more than one metric. Now, so that's one possibility, is that all the dominoes are set up from the beginning, right? But there's another possibility, which is that you have inside of you like a spark of the divine will. Because what is the nature of God, the nature of omnipotence, is to be miraculous, is to resist the laws of physics, to disrupt determinism. And the more that we can potentially wake up to that divine aspect of self, I believe the more we are enabled to disrupt whatever merit or karma or determinism we may be operating under. And that's the solution. I prefer to think about this as the solution as opposed to the dominoes, because some people might have the dominoes set up and other people might not. This suggests that there's actually something that you can do. You actually have some skin in the game. You're not just a robot. You're not just an automaton. You can do this or not, and you will either benefit or suffer as a consequence. That seems, whether or not that is objectively, empirically true, that seems to be way more useful to me than the dominoes.
Right.
And the more we get in the habit of exercising that free will, it's like a muscle, not just like a bicep, but like focus, like attention. The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
I've set up a sort of useful cognitive dissonance where in the moment I will basically have this this strong feeling and belief in free will, and similar to what you're describing. But then I might retroactively allow myself to believe in that everything is just dominoes falling if it is useful. Like if that mental process can relinquish me from some sort of regret. Okay. If that makes sense. I'm not really recommending this.
I mean, that's a technique that everybody uses. It's like, it's a way of assuaging guilt and responsibility. It wasn't your fault. It was the road was slippery. It was late at night. This would have happened to anybody else. It's not a failure in your own personal virtue or value or capacity.
But at the same time, it can also be useful to believe that, like, I have the most heroic, divine, amazing chain of dominoes, and it's like in my fate and in my cards that this amazing, great thing is gonna, my future is gonna be fantastic.
Well, I guess that would be more useful in thinking that your future is going to be full of despair and loss and pain. But I mean, surely at some point you would be disappointed enough times to potentially question that, because it's not like life is just this trajectory that's upward and to the right.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you're positively delusional enough, you can be like, oh, that was just, one of the filler dominoes. It's just a filler, and we're going to get back to the main story where I become a hero or something.
Just set me up for a comeback. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can see that. I mean,
Right.
There might be something adaptive about that. Mm-hmm. But I think the idea of there being a chain of dominoes is a consequence of our own subjective memory. It's just that, like, when we look back at our previous actions and choices as we remember them, we only see one chain of events. And so it appears in retrospection to be a chain of dominoes. But that's certainly not how we experience projecting into the future. We don't think of things just being on an unchangeable set of rails moving forward, but we can't do anything to change anything that happened in the past. So there's this enormous, but that's more of an artifact of our own memory, I think, than a characteristic of, let's say, objective reality.
It reminds me of the particle on the double slit experiment. It's like, in the past, everything is dominoes. In the future, everything is like this magical potential dust. Yeah. And so, like, experiences both of these at the same time.
And that doesn't make sense,
right.
Because the time is the same. Remember, the time doesn't really move, That's like saying 2 miles of absolute space that way is somehow different than the space that exists right here. Like, the weather might be different, the terrain might be different, but the space that occupies those things is fundamentally the same, whether it's here or 2 miles away. Things do seem to happen as they needed to in retrospect. Yeah. Now, some people could argue that the reason why the future looks like a bunch of branching paths or fairy dust is just because of our own ignorance or our lack of knowledge, and that if we did thoroughly and completely understand the deterministic laws under which we're operating, even like at a quantum level, and we're able to compute that for all known particles in the universe, we would conceivably be able to predict the future like dominoes. I don't know if that's true. And it's certainly well beyond our capacity to do so. It's like, does it matter?
Do you have a meditation practice that you do regularly, or?
Sometimes I sit down and meditate, like actually in a posture and close my eyes. I tend to prefer concentrational meditations to mindfulness meditations, where I want to focus on a very specific thing as opposed to just like being aware of my inner processes.
Oh, okay. So kind of you focus on the breath, or?
Often it's the breath. Often it's it can also be like like the field of consciousness. Sometimes I focus on if I'm trying to empty my mind of conceptual forms.
Okay.
But as soon as I say the field of consciousness, that becomes another conceptual form. So it's difficult to put into words.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I'm mostly just trying to become more mindfully aware of my moment-to-moment existence. Like anything can be meditative if you bring the right awareness to it. And sitting in lotus posture can be a complete waste of time if you don't have the right attention.
I imagine most people listening to your earlier story of when you were hiking think, hey, that's pretty great. I want to do that. Do you have any recommendation? I mean, it sounds like this has been a long time coming, but
Well, I've been
do you have
interested
any
in
recommendations?
Yeah, like I say, I don't know why it happened then. You know what I'm saying? And this stuff is mysterious. It's like I had been meditating for over 10 or 15 years before that happened, in various different traditions with many different teachers. Like it was a big part of my life. Since a teenager, I've been interested in spirituality and enlightenment and that kind of thing. And I've traveled all over the world and worked with many different people. But like why it happened at that point and not in another 50 years or 10 years earlier, I have no idea.
That was a meditation retreat, or you said you were hiking?
I was just doing a solo backpacking trip by myself.
Okay.
On the Pacific Crest Trail.
So you hadn't talked to anyone for several days?
Usually on the trail, you talk to maybe one or two people a day.
Okay. Well, and when you were walking, were you like specifically trying to meditate, or you just enjoying the?
That trip was difficult. This was right after my mother finally passed away, and I decided to go out into the wilderness to kind of process my grief. And so I took, I think, 3 weeks to do that. So I wasn't just looking at the pretty trees, and I wasn't the whole time just trying to achieve enlightenment. You know, I was doing a lot of inner processing. And for me, it's most helpful to do that in motion, to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier, as I do think there's a connection between the mind and the body. And whether I'm like driving in a car or just walking or hiking, like when I'm in motion, it's like my thoughts, sometimes for some reason they get clearer. Like I can see them better. I can unravel them. I'm not sure, but I had a lot of things on my mind when I went out into the wilderness that time. And so why I would suddenly arrive at that place under those conditions when I decided to actually meditate one night when I was out there by myself, who knows?
It's interesting because another guest I had on the podcast, Ruben Laukkanen, he's a neuroscientist. He investigates meditative states or themes, neuroscientific themes surrounding meditation. And he had an experience that sounds quite similar to yours in terms of this kind of entering this experience of only pure awareness, or like a ceasing of consciousness, you might say.
Or ceasing of the objects of consciousness, maybe, is what I would say. Because I would think that consciousness still existed.
Oh, yeah, no, it wasn't like a coma or anything. So, but it sounds similar, his experience. And his too was after a particular, like this, a large bout of despair. It sounded like he told the story on the episode. So I just thought that was an interesting common theme, how you guys were both wrestling with something very difficult before entering into that state.
There's like that biblical parable of, who is it? The one who wrestles with the angel. Is it Jacob? I think it might be Jacob. where an angel comes down from heaven and he grabs the angel and says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And the angel says, get out of here. I got to go back up. And so let go of me. And he's like, no, I'm not going to let you go. And the angel flies up and he's like, I don't care if you drop me. I'm not going to do anything. You have to bless me. And eventually the angel concedes and blesses him. That's my remembering of the story. Maybe I got some things wrong. But I think that has a deep psychological truth to it, which is like you can get really good things in life, like a divine blessing. Is there anything better than that potentially? But like you might have to wrestle with the angel. You might have to face death and being dropped from the heights in order to finally get it. It's like, what do you think? You're just going to lay in bed and ask for it? Like it's just going to be handed to you on a silver platter? Like you can't get money that way. What makes you think you can get peace that way? What makes you think you can get contentment that way or enlightenment that way? Those things are so much harder to get than money. And how hard is it to get money? You know what I'm saying? So it's like sometimes things are appropriately gate kept behind dangerous and difficult experiences.
Yeah, like wasn't it the Buddha, when he finally reached his enlightenment, he had gone through all these trials and tribulations, and then he said something like, I will sit here until my bones break and I turn into a corpse and all this, and I won't move until I get enlightenment. And then it finally happened.
Well, if it's not going to happen to somebody who's done all of that and is willing to risk everything, then you can't get it. Then the game is just rigged. You know what I'm saying? Or it's so arbitrary that there's nothing you can do about it anyway. So thank God, like it would be possible under those conditions. It shows that it's possible. But like there is some sort of fairness to the universe. It doesn't always look fair. But on a deep level, maybe there is some sort of justice. It's like, you know, on a very basic material level, it's like I can either have my $3 or I can have my cup of coffee. But I can't have both. Like if I want the cup of coffee, I have to surrender the $3. So there's a price and a cost to everything that we hope to get. Like for example, the price of peace might be your own disquietude. Like you might have to surrender your tendencies for discontentment, for irritability, for judgmentalism, if you want peace. Peace is a wonderful, good thing. You can't buy it, not even with $1 billion. Like it's beyond value. So to think that you can get it without giving anything up is insane. And generally the thing you have to give up is in proportion to the value that you hope to derive from the thing that you hope to receive.
There was this particular brain study that I had read. What was the scientist's name? Like Eliana Vasena, I think. And she noticed that the parts of the brain that process reward overlap with the parts of the brain that process effort. So it's almost like baked into the brain that obviously the difficult thing is more rewarding.
Which can be difficult because this can lead people into thinking that all difficulty or struggle is good and all pleasure and comfort is bad. And that's not true either. Like a lot of people are struggling or suffering unnecessarily. It's not making them stronger.
And
it's not making them more virtuous. It's like just stop. Don't do it. You're just spending the money, but you're not getting anything in return.
Would you agree that leads to things like busy work? Like you're just like, oh, sure, this is tough and I'm grinding really hard. It's got to pay off.
Yeah, when people do that, it's kind of a form of procrastination. I think most people on some level know what they should at least stop doing in order to move in the direction of greater health or happiness or maturity or prosperity. Most people know. But they haven't given that up yet. It's like this when they really should be attending to that. It's sort of like cleaning your house when you have an important paper to write. It's like now's not the time to do that. It's the time to write your paper. So thank God that it might be possible to get those things, but man, they might cost people everything to get. But maybe on the other side of it, if you believe these traditions or these scriptures, is everything. And that would suggest that there's some sort of fairness to things. Like if you're willing to give everything up, you get everything in return. Like you had the example of Buddha, but there's also the example of Jesus, who basically said, like, those who seek to preserve their lives will lose them. And those who lose their lives will gain eternal life, or something like that. If you approach that literally, it's difficult to understand, or it even seems absurd or unreasonable. But there might be a deeper significance to those words, that everything has a price and you can't get out of paying it. And some of those prices might be baked into reality.
I feel like that's a fundamental lesson that people are losing nowadays.
Everything is relative, it's your opinion, or
I mean, like, you don't have to make a sacrifice at some point.
oh, like entitlement. I mean, that's what that is. It's mine by rights. It's my right to have these things.
Yeah.
And or at least it's not your right to have those things that I might want. That's even more insidious, envy.
But then the attitude of entitlement kind of cheapens whatever they get, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's hard to feel grateful for something you feel entitled to.
Yeah.
And it's certainly hard to feel content if you feel entitled to things that you don't yet have and other people do. Like that's a recipe for all kinds of malicious discontentment. There's a really interesting paper I read called The Varieties of Envy. It's more of a theoretical paper than a research paper, but it's really fascinating. And they talk about how there's actually 4 different kinds of envy in their conceptualization. You can think of it like a quadrant. And the 2 axes have to do with whether the good in question is like a zero-sum good or not. And the other axis has to do with whether I believe I can obtain that through my own power or not. So, for example, there is one of those 4 quadrants they called emulative envy, which they said is a positive form of envy. That occurs when I think that the good in question is not a zero sum, which means you can have it and I can have it, and it's within my power to get it. It's almost like you're inspiring me to do the work to get that for myself. That's emulative envy. And they think that that's a positive experience. I can see that. By the same token, what's the opposite of that? Is that it's a zero sum and I can't get it. And if I'm not willing to surrender wanting it, those 2 things are going to eat me up inside. And so if I can't surrender my desire for that thing that you have that I believe I can't get, whether that's accurate or not, the best I can do is spoil it for you so that nobody has it. And so if I can't have the desire, if I can't have it, no one can. That's kind of the attitude there. And that is the motivation of malicious envy. There's a lot of that in the world, unfortunately. When there might be reason to have more emulative envy. Like we live in a world where there's more potential social mobility than probably at any point in human history, where things were mostly locked in castes and landed classes of people, and they lived their whole lives in their small villages and did the professions of their parents and their grandparents. It's like people have so much freedom to move now than they ever have. Why not assume that you can move in the direction of getting what you want?
The malicious envy, I can't quite get myself in that headspace.
It's hard. I felt that before. I don't want to.
I'd say right now. I don't mean I was like I'm a saint and I've never experienced that, but the moment.
Usually more when I was younger. Yeah, like as an adolescent or even a child. It does feel a little immature, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the example, one of the more famous examples of that, I suppose, was the parable of the the child and the two mothers and King Solomon from the Bible. Do you remember that one? So there was a woman who had a baby. She was the biological mother. And there was another woman who, for whatever reason, couldn't conceive a child. And she was motivated, therefore, by her envy of this woman to steal the baby and to insist that she was the true mother. And this led to a dispute that was brought in front of King Solomon. And both mothers were insisting that it was their baby. And this was, thousands of years ago. There was no genetic testing back then. So what Solomon proposed was that since both mothers seemed to have an equal right or claim to the child should be cut in half. And half delivered to the one woman and half delivered to the other. And one woman said, okay, that's fair. And the other woman said, no, it's not my baby. Please, I lied. And that was the real mother. And so that was the test that Solomon enacted on these women to see who really, because the real mother would rather that the child live apart from her than to have the child die. Whereas the woman who was the imposter and was operating under the malicious envy would be content to just have the good destroyed, which was a constant reminder of her own inability to conceive, which was torturing her.
Did he give the baby to the appropriate?
Yes, he did. He was purportedly the wisest man who ever lived, so he figured that out. There's a lot of easy things that he did. There's another example from the Bible where two brothers came in with a dispute about their inheritance. Like they had both received some sort of allotment of land from their father. It said half is going to go here and half is going to go there. And every time they just couldn't decide on where to draw the line. When this guy drew the line and said, okay, this will be mine, this will be yours. It's like, hey, you got the river and you got more. It's like, so the simplest way that Solomon resolved that is said, okay, you draw the borders and you can draw them however you want. And he gets to pick which one he wants.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's so simple. It's so elegant. And let me tell you, the guy who was drawing the borders made absolutely sure that they were as even as possible because he had no control over which one was going to be his.
I feel like that's the thing my parents did with us. It's like, all right, you guys get to split the pizza or whatever it is, the pie or the piece of pie, but one gets to cut and one gets to pick.
Okay.
Right, so
there it is. Same basic premise.
Right.
Yep. And now you're going to be very careful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very wise.
So there's a lot of our problems actually have potentially simpler solutions than we might think. But simple isn't the same as easy. Simple and easy are not the same thing. I had a mentor once who talked about how simplicity was a sign of mastery. And you see that in other respects. I think, like maybe it was Einstein who talked about, so Einstein or Feynman, I'm misremembering right now. But like if you couldn't explain this to a 10-year-old, you don't really understand it on some level. The idea to very simply communicate and exist in reality is a skill that requires a lot of experience and training to accomplish in the vast majority of cases. Usually we go from, it's like that curve, like the Socratic curve. This guy says he doesn't know. He's ignorant. Everyone in the middle thinks they know. Socrates doesn't think he knows. But his ignorance isn't quite the same ignorance as the person over there. So when we all start out, we're generally like naively simple. And then we mostly inappropriately overcomplicate our lives. And hopefully some of us get to a point where we can simplify things down to what truly matters.
Kind of like a Dunning-Kruger effect? Not quite.
So Dunning-Kruger, that one has to do with people, the fact that if you are incompetent, you don't have the competence to understand that you're incompetent. Is that it? I think that's what it is.
Right. It's like different levels of arrogance or like confidence in your capability.
That's certainly part of it. It's like, when was I most arrogant? When I knew the least, for sure. when I was a teenager. Man, I thought I knew everything, and all the adults around me were just so stupid.
Yeah.
It's so obvious.
Right.
And you think you see that in some of the social causes that young people are subject to following. It's like, just do this, people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's like, oh, it's so obvious. It's like, why did we pick Greta Thunberg to be famous?
Be careful.
She's like,
or Gabor Mate for that.
Yeah, that naive 80-year-old.
I don't know why people become famous. This is, maybe you know something about this, but I've been thinking about this a lot because it touches more on my business nowadays as a social media person. Is have we really studied virality in any kind of deep way? Like, can we predict when and how and why certain things go viral, whether it's a viral organism in a population or an idea or a meme? Wouldn't that make a bunch of money?
Oh,
Wouldn't
yeah.
that be super useful?
Yeah, there's tons of themes to, or like ideas about it, and people who seem to have kind of a finger on the pulse for it. So
It's true. Some people do seem to have a knack for like figuring out what the next thing is going to be. Yeah. But oftentimes they're also in a position to influence what the next thing is going to be.
So Veritasium has a very good video on this about why a particular video of his went viral. And he was kind of explaining virality a bit, or why certain things get clicked. I mean, of course, if he had the perfect formula, then all of his videos would be performing as well as his best video, right? But he was saying when he showed Mr. Beast the thumbnail he was going to go with before he published the video, Mr. Beast was like, oh yeah, that's a banger. That's going to go viral. And it did. And it's like one of his best performing videos. And there's just...
I saw a video on the evolution of a Mr. Beast thumbnail. Have you seen this? Like, some of these thumbnails, at least in this example, go through at least 100 different iterations.
Oh yeah.
Where like the facial expression gets changed minutely, the color of a person's shirt in the background gets switched from red to blue, the size of the fonts gets manipulated. It was fascinating. Like, they certainly could turn it more into a science. They have a lot of the data to potentially begin to study that in earnest. I hope they would.
Yeah, he's getting there. The difficult part is your content has to be congruent with the thumbnail. So you have to kind of like hit it at all points in the process. So like the title, the thumbnail, and then the content has to be congruent to it. So you could have a Mr. Beast thumbnail, but if you don't deliver in as spectacular a way as Mr. Beast, then what's going to happen is you're going to click through. You have a bunch of people click through, but then the average watch time is going to be very low. So then the algorithm will kind of like punish that. So that might have been a formula for virality in the past, but at least with the current algorithm, that doesn't work. So part of his thing is he's got such a massive budget that he'll do these.
It's not just A/B tests. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K tests.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He's like, he's doing all sorts of A/B tests for the thumbnails and stuff, but then also the content itself is just so ridiculous. Like the most recent one was, I think, what was it? Oh, if you can defend the yacht, you can keep it. So there was a yacht on the water, and then he like showed all the different things, like cannonballs and like flaming arrows and stuff that he's going to shoot at it. But you get a certain budget to protect it with like shipyard containers, and you have like a construction crew who's going to like construct whatever plan you have.
Yeah,
it's just
that's
nuts.
wild. I couldn't do something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely like he's got the thumbnail idea, but then he's also delivering on these like massive scale ideas.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Because like theoretically, we could create a perfect thumbnail based on our understanding of what components work better with certain audiences. But if that doesn't actually correlate in a meaningful way with the content, it's not going to matter.
Right.
Yeah.
But then in terms of like why things go viral in general, that's like a more like, I don't know if this is just my Instagram feed because I've clicked on it, but there's this cat and he's meowing in this he's meowing in this particular way, and then it's been turned into a song. Okay. And that is all over my Instagram feed. And it has like each post has like millions of views. It's the I Go Meow Cat, if you want to look it up. But I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, if you look at one ass on Instagram, pretty soon your entire search page is populated. But I got the same thing.
I have asses than meowing cats, but yeah, it's true. It's like, it looks like I'm going to be looking at asses for the next 2 weeks. Thanks, Instagram. And there's just like these phases that the algorithm seems to go through.
Right.
Now I'm getting a lot of like learn Japanese memes.
Okay. That could be a location thing, right?
Could be, or that
or you clicked on one, right?
Clicked on one, or I saved one. I think that's even more powerful for the algorithm when you save something. I think it's when you save, you share, you like. No, you save, you share, you comment, you like, and maybe even if you view on the For You page.
Oh, you're talking about so saving is the strongest?
That's what I'm understanding. I understand that to be the case. Cool. I don't know if that's true because it's kind of mysterious. At least they don't reveal the weighting of the algorithm, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, right. That'd be nice. Like, here's how to go viral on our platform.
Yeah, but it would just be like that guy about the war. It's like, this is how you win a war. It's like the Maginot line. Oh, we'll just build this long wall to keep the Germans out. It's like they just fucking went around it. You know? So there's always going to be a game of cops and robbers with respect to this, and that's probably for the best to prevent people from just gaming the system. It's incredibly infuriating, though. As soon as you start to feel like you're making some progress, it's like they change the rules on you.
Yeah. You got to be pretty adaptable.
It's like survival of the fittest, right? Fittest doesn't necessarily mean the best or the strongest. It means the one most able to accommodate to the changing realities of their environment.
Yeah. It used to be that if you had tons of subscribers, then it meant you guaranteed views.
Why?
On YouTube, that's just how it works. It was kind of like, because like now you have like, I guess it's where your, I can't totally remember how it worked, but it's like where the videos of the channels you're subscribed to are placed. So I think before it was like your homepage wasn't just random videos, it was all your subscriptions.
Yeah, okay.
And now it's like, it's kind of demoted a little bit more because you don't just have to get people to subscribe. You have to get them to subscribe and click the bell.
Yeah, I've never told anyone to do that. There's something inside of me that doesn't want to, because as soon as they start doing that, it's going to be subscribe and then ring the bell and then
like and share, comment.
Pull the lever. It's like, what's the next thing after everyone gets trained to ring the bell?
Right.
It's going to be something else. So I don't know if we want to go down that road. It's already tedious enough to ask people to do all those things, right?
Right.
But I think I said, well, is it true that having a lot of subscribers guarantees you views? Because I think a lot of people...
in the past, not now.
Okay, but... Oh, sure. Okay. I haven't been doing this for as long as you have, so I'll defer to your...
It's of course, it does guarantee a certain amount of views.
A certain amount, yeah.
It's just, it used to be much larger in the past.
I just think of my own behaviors. Sometimes I'll discover somebody or a channel and I'll potentially get really enthusiastic and fall down that rabbit hole, and I'll watch a lot of the videos. And because of kind of audience capture and because of the interrelationship between content creator, content consumer, and the algorithm, sometimes after about like 70, 80 videos, sometimes even earlier, it's like they start repeating themselves, the content creators. And it's almost like, okay, we've exhausted this source of information. He or she is just saying the same thing over again. And I might not unsubscribe, but I might not watch their videos, certainly not as regularly as I do. Sometimes it would have to be a really compelling title or a thumbnail to get me to click on somebody that I have previously consumed a lot of their content.
Speaking of that, what kind of so, I mean, you've become very famous for your perspective on interpersonal relationships. Are there other places you're looking to? I mean, and that's the theme of your book, right? Are there other places you're looking to explore into, other types of content you'd like to, or like themes you'd like to talk about? Is what I mean.
Well, I will continue to do this for as long as it seems like as long as I want to do this, as long as it still doesn't become like a grind or a job or things like that. And to that end, I think it's helpful that I haven't like quit all of my other occupations to devote myself exclusively to this. I noticed that when I became a professional actor, like acting became less fun when it was my job, you know? And I also want to be willing and able to pursue my own interests. So there certainly is that pull that I experience to be siloed into a specific genre of content. In my case, it would be intersexual relationships, because those videos get 4 times as many views as the ones about panic attacks, or the ones about confidence, or the ones about spirituality. But on some level, even though it's not in my immediate financial best interest to make those videos, I'm going to continue to make those videos. Not only because, I want to have fun doing this. I don't want it to just be a grind, like I'm a copywriter, like I'm a hack, just like writing out words because to fill a newspaper or something like that. I don't want to feel that way. But it's a defense against what I just described. So one of my rules of thumb is I try not to say anything in any episode that I've said before.
I've noticed that. Yeah.
They're very different. Each episode is very different, which is sometimes too bad, because the first 98, my first episode that went viral was my 98th episode. And it only went viral months after it was produced, right? So even more came out before then. And I don't know what your experience was, but people often don't go back and watch the old episodes. Yeah. Sometimes they'll just like start watching from that point onward. And there's a lot of good content in those first 100 episodes, but I don't want to repeat myself because I've already said it. You know what I'm saying? So the idea here is, as long as I don't repeat myself, I might be able to avoid becoming completely known and therefore cast aside, which is generally what people do in these. They fall down a rabbit hole. They say, "Oh, I get this guy. You know, this guy says make your bed. You know, this guy says this, that, okay, I get him. Okay, who's next?" If you keep saying different things, it's harder to do that. But it's also harder to keep saying different things. Yeah. Not only because you have to be somewhat endlessly creative, but because it goes against your immediate best interest to do so. But it might be in your longer term best interest to do so. We'll see. It's an experiment.
How do you come up with your video ideas? You just wake up and say, "Oh, that would make a good topic"?
Usually I get my ideas through conversations with people. Sometimes, every once in a while, it's through I just have a thought when I'm by myself. But the vast majority of the time, the ideas come from conversations with other people, especially conversations with my patients or my clients. Mm. And I think that's really useful because it keeps me connected to folks out there who are dealing with real problems. So I try to make episodes that speak to what people are really experiencing out in the world so that they kind of stay relevant. It's not, if I stopped talking to people and I was just creating castles in my mind, I might become even weirder than I already am, or more divorced from reality, you know? So talking to actual people helps me to remain relevant. And I also, it's like I have all these feelers out there in the world. I talk to hundreds of people every month from all different walks of life. And so I have these feelers about what's actually going on in the here and now in all kinds of different cultures and all kinds of different strata within those cultures too. It's not like I'm just turning on the news and that's what's happening in the world. I have first person on the street accounts from hundreds of people from all over the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is immensely useful.
And it's really important to have something that will kind of shield you against whatever's said on the internet. Because, for example, I'm going to Seattle, and I was all nervous about it because I had seen some things on Twitter about bad things happening in Seattle, or I saw some article saying that the crime in Seattle had gone up this certain amount.
It has.
And though I talked with my friend who's living there, and he said, "Oh no, it's fine. I don't worry about it." I was like, "Well, but should I be worried or not?" I was like, "Well, I'm going anyway, so I might as well listen to the guy who says it's
Japanese
okay."
people who say that they wouldn't travel to America because it's too unsafe. Everyone's got a gun. You're going to get shot.
Oh yeah.
Like America in general.
Yeah.
I don't know how it's being portrayed in the Japanese media. Clearly, we have more gun violence in America than you have in Japan, right? But I don't go through my life expecting that I'm going to be shot in my community, right? So people do get anchored at other points, and certain things just make for better television than others, So this has to do with like the medium is the message. I have noticed that Japanese news is really boring. Like I remember I was watching the news the other day, and I don't speak Japanese, but it seemed like the major news story was it rained. And there were like pictures of puddles slowly accumulating water with not even any voiceover. It was almost zen.
Usually the news is, it's not always that low tier, but things will happen every now and then, but there's not that many big stories. And every now and then it'll be like, so-and-so senior person mistook the brake for the accelerator and pressed on the accelerator and then drove into this building, and like it was only her who was hurt and not that bad. So it's, the news is, sometimes there are big things that's happened, but it's not like school shootings or.
I stopped watching the news many years ago,
Yeah.
like as a conscious choice. And I have a free weekly newsletter that people can sign up for that I started doing very recently. And every week I include a little I call it a behavioral experiment, which is a suggestion that people can implement for a week. And if they like it, they can keep doing it. And if it doesn't work, they can throw it out. Doesn't matter. Just like I'm inviting you to consider trying this and to see what kind of impact it has on your experience or your life. And one of the recent experiments was stop watching the news for a week. That means no mainstream media, but also not like news memes on social media, which is often how people get their news these days. And I received a few email pushbacks to that, which were basically like, well, Orion, how do I stay informed about what's happening in the world? Like that just seems irresponsible. And my rebuttal to those is basically, well, what do you do with that information? Like, does that information actually motivate you to take some form of constructive action in the world? Because what I was noticing is that when I would watch the news, I would see all of these scenes of war and disaster and catastrophe and tragedy, and I would feel impotently enraged or hopeless.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do anything about it. Like, what am I supposed to do with the how am I supposed to do anything to resolve the conflicts that are happening around the world?
Yeah.
Or a natural disaster that occurred, on the other side of the planet. It's not that I don't feel for human suffering, but I don't understand why it helps anybody else if I'm vicariously suffering as well.
Right. What would be fantastic is if everybody had news that only pertained to their
domain of action.
Yeah, like their town.
Although it's like in the same way that people kind of have contempt for like useless academic knowledge. Like, why are you studying that? What good is that? What use is like learning those facts? What use is studying this? Like, what are you going to do with that? Like, people understand that when it comes to certain university degrees.
Oh, yeah.
They don't think about that with respect to the news.
Right.
But like the purpose of knowledge information should be to put it into constructive action.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just going to be filled with all of this stuff, and it's going to make you feel terrible. And it could very well be, this was basically argued in Jerry Mander's 4 Arguments for the Elimination of
Oh,
Television.
yeah.
You've read that one?
Yeah.
I
My
like that
brother recommended it to me.
Yeah, that's an oldie but goodie. That's designed, the news is designed intentionally in that way to facilitate you to buy whatever advertisements are going to show up at the commercial break. Because you're now in an emotionally compromised state. And we know that when people are in an emotionally compromised state, either because they are feeling fearful, or they're usually fearful, or angry, they're more likely to make emotional decisions that aren't based on, reason or necessity.
That is such a good point.
just like
I didn't think
clickbait.
about that one. Yeah. It's like, I'm pissed off. I'll get that McDonald's cheeseburger.
It's at least something that you can do,
Right.
because you can't solve the Middle East,
Yeah.
but you might be able to anesthetize the cultivated rage inside of you by eating or buying something.
Yeah. 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 I always thought like globalism is pretty bad in general because
There's some good things about it.
no, yeah, for sure. But this in particular, like, I don't need to know about this terrible thing that happened in a different country that I can't do anything about. Exactly as you're saying.
So this might sound weird, but on some level, I don't allow myself to care about things I'm not willing to do anything about.
That sounds good.
Because if a person cares about something, but they also don't do anything, or they can't do anything about that issue, then they're worse.
Oh yeah, there was
They're part of the problem.
there was a particular psychologist or psychiatrist who was investigating what were the factors that allowed people to get out of depression, and very basically what you're saying, behavioral activation, is that the word? Yeah, so behavioral activation. Well, he basically said those who had a strong desire to learn how to regulate their emotions and then induce the necessary effort to do so, that was fantastic. But the people who had a strong desire to get better but didn't do anything, they would end up much worse than someone who is almost like apathetic to their outcome.
Sure. It creates more cognitive dissonance. Like if you know so much, why are you still in this situation on some level?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's exactly the same thing. Like, for example, this was an arrogance that I was guilty of that probably kept me depressed longer than I needed to be, which was that people would give me well-meaning suggestions that sometimes in retrospect probably would have been effective at alleviating my depression. But at that time I thought, I understand that. I understand that that would be good for me to do. And so I didn't think I needed to do it because I understood it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Kinda.
It's clearly not very healthy. It was a product of
Yeah.
potentially my immaturity or that depressive state. But sometimes people think that it's enough to know it and not to do it.
Oh yeah. I could sort of.
They know that it's good to be patient, but they're not patient. They know that it's good to be kind, but they're not.
It's like the simple things like, you'd feel so much better if you go to the gym. It's like, yeah, I know, but
Exactly.
everybody knows that. It's like, then why don't you do it?
And so I forget who said it, but there's a quote that basically says that to act is to know. To act is to know. Or to know is to act. I forget which one it is, but it could be on one, right? Which is that, like, unless you do it, you don't really know it.
Yeah.
If you think this would be good for you and you don't do it, then you
Right.
don't really understand on a deep level that it would be good for you.
Right. It's like your behaviors reflect more of, I guess, your actual.
Your understanding.
Uh-huh.
Your understanding is revealed through your behavior, through your actions. Yes.
Right.
Not through your ability to say nice words or to solve the riddle or to speak the appropriate belief or to answer the question with the correct factual information. Your understanding is revealed through your actions.
Yeah. And there's something, this is a kind of a small thing, but lately I've been waking up really early and nothing's open, so I'll go and do my work in the park. And I kind of, like I was saying to you earlier, I was saying like, oh, it's bad that we have all this access to information about other countries where it's going to be stuff that's going to maybe anger us or frustrate us, but we can't actually do anything. And that sort of saps our energy to do something useful for the community that you are actually situated in. And so,
well, sure, if the whole planet is going to melt and the polar ice caps are going to, why pick up the litter in the park?
right.
That's
Or kind of that, but I guess I also meant like you have like wasted your limited mental bandwidth on that.
Oh yeah,
Right.
we often don't appreciate that we do have limited bandwidths. There's only so many fucks we can give.
Yeah.
On some level.
Yeah.
On any given day, and now you've wasted a fuck on something that you can't do anything about.
Right.
Why would you do that?
Right. So what I was going to say was like, I've been going to the park, and it's clearly some kids because it's all like these like little candy wrappers that are, the park is like pristine except for the one table and bench that I work at. And like, it's always like this, and they have like, they're eating like the same candy. So I suspect it's the same group of kids. It's like all this litter around there. Not that much, but anyways, I just was like, all right, well, what am I going to do? Like sit here and wait for the kids till I can yell at them? I'll just pick it up. So I've just been like picking it up pretty much every morning. And just something about that, I kind of like the park more, if that makes sense. It's kind of like, I felt like it was like on some level, it's like, oh, you like this park, but your actions also reflect that you like the park.
Well, that makes sense to me on a lot of different levels. For example, one secret to get people to like you more is to ask them to do things for you.
Mm.
You can't make someone like you more by doing things for them. You can't like someone into liking you.
Mm.
However, you can kind of cultivate interest and appreciation if you can motivate or incentivize other people to do things for you. Why? Because it creates, in the first place, cognitive dissonance. The person who agrees, even if it's a small request, hey, could you pass me the salt, or would you mind picking up something on the way to our date or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
People are not in the habit of going out of their way for other people. They're not in the habit of doing favors for other people or being altruistically generous. And yet here they are doing things for you. Why would that be the case? And in general, the way that cognitive dissonance is collapsed is, well, Joseph must be an important person to me. Yeah, that's why I'm going out of my way for Joseph. I guess he's special to me. I must like him.
Mm-hmm.
So here you invested more into cleaning the park. You did something for the park, and so you like the park more.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Makes sense.
This is like, where does emotion come from? There's the Cannon-Bard hypothesis and the
James-Lange.
James-Lange, that's right. And Cannon-Bard says that we get scared and therefore we run away. But James Laird, I think it is, the other one?
Lange, yeah.
James-Lange, excuse me. I just said it, I forgot. They say that you get scared because you run away.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I think that's important for adults to understand. I think in general, like small kids, they get afraid and then they run. But for most of us, most of adults, we're afraid because we're running.
Mm.
We're ashamed because we're hiding.
Yeah, yeah.
We're angry because we're judging. So sometimes the best way to resolve those fears or those emotions is to take the opposite action that might be responsible for the lion's share of their cultivation. If I asked you to hide something that wasn't even socially unacceptable for you to hide, you would likely feel more ashamed, just as a consequence of the fact that you're hiding something.
Yeah, I can see that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So one of the best ways of resolving what we might say unjustified shame is to take an opposite action against that behavioral impulse and to reveal proudly.
Mm-hmm.
right? One of the opposite action to fear is to stand your ground and to turn around instead of stop running.
Yeah.
One of the opposite action of anger, which often motivates us to like aggressively approach, is to like gently avoid.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do the opposite action, it will generally collapse the emotion. Because if the feeling state and the behavior are misaligned, human biology or psychology, for whatever reason, tends to collapse in favor of the behavior.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the hardest things to do is to act in spite of your emotional impulses.
Right.
It's like Oscar Wilde, I can resist anything except temptation. It's like, yeah, no shit.
It's like the whole approach anxiety thing. Guys are like, oh, how do I diffuse my approach anxiety? And
By approaching.
yeah.
It's the only way to do it.
Right.
There is no secret.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's literally the only thing you can do. Because
Everything else is just preparation.
right.
At best.
It's the fact that you're not approaching is justifying the anxiety or reinforcing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
As long as you have the desire to approach it.
Well, especially because the not approaching is reinforced in multiple ways. Like, for example, when a guy sees an attractive girl and thinks, oh, I should go up and talk to her, usually that's when the anxiety begins to spike.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the punishment of that inner experience, that anxiety, which is not pleasant. But if I were to chicken out or avoid, then I'm negatively reinforced by the removal of that anxiety, which makes it more likely that the next time I experience anxiety, I'm going to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that that's consistently associated with a reduction in anxiety. What's also associated with an reduction in anxiety is to do the feared thing. Once you do it, you can't be scared of it. We usually are afraid of things anticipatorily that exist in our imagination. Once you do it, it's like, oh, that wasn't so bad. So that's the other way to resolve or diminish your anxiety. You can avoid or you can go through.
Mm-hmm.
Those are generally the only two ways. Or you can take drugs.
Yeah. What was that Mark Twain quote where he said something like, I have feared so many terrible things in my life.
That never happened?
None of which happened, or something like that.
Yeah. I think it was probably like I suffered so many terrible things in my life, most of which never happened.
Yeah.
We suffer much more in our imaginations than in reality. I think Seneca said that.
Right. Anywhere we should point the viewers to find your
if
stuff?
you want to see more of my stuff, go on YouTube, Psych Hacks. I publish episodes regularly. Please consider checking out my book, The Value of Others. I put a lot of effort into it. I think it's really good.
Can it be on Amazon? And
it's Amazon. There's a paperback version, an ebook version, and a audiobook version.
Oh, great.
That I recorded.
Great.
I don't think that there's a book quite like it that I've ever read. So I'm very happy with the way it turned out, and I'm excited to see how it does out in its own little life.
Awesome. I've been looking forward to it.
Thanks, man.
For a long time. Ever since you mentioned it when I met you, that you're working on it. It's like,
I'm
hurry
looking
up.
forward. Yeah. Can't wait.
Great. Well, Orion, thanks so much.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you.